My name is Miqueias Mugi. I'm a researcher and a historian at the Brazil Lab at the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. And I want to welcome you all to the 2025 Stanley J. Stein Honorific Lecture. Before I introduce our distinguished guests, I want to take a moment to honor Stanley J. Stein, the brilliant historian whose legacy we celebrate today. Stan joined Princeton's history department in 1953 and remained here until his passing in December 2019, just shy of his 100th birthday. A pioneer in Latin American studies, he became the first director of Princeton's program in Latin American studies in 1967. PLAS is co-organizing this event, and I would like to thank Gabriela Nozel's PLAS director for our partnership. Stan's scholarship, developed together with his partner Barbara Stein, shaped the field of Latin American and economic and social history with a focus on Brazil and Mexico. His classic work, for all Brazilians in the room, Vassouras, a Brazilian coffee county, published in 1957, remains a landmark study. Stan was a visionary researcher, drawing from history, geography, and anthropology to reconstruct the world of 19th century Brazil. Reflecting on Vassouras, Stan, described his approach as aiming to recreate a sense of ambience, as would a human geographer do, integrating soil, topography, climate, and man, to detect networks of community through the lenses of the social anthropologist, to achieve a historian's perception of factors and processes over time. Long before oral history became widespread, Stan relied on local archives and interviews with surviving formerly enslaved workers, a groundbreaking innovation of the time. Stan remains an endless source of inspiration to us, and we are honored to have his son, Peter Stein, with us today. And we send, through Peter, our warmest regards to Margot and Joel and Stan's loved ones. Thank you, Peter, for being here today. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Brodwyn Fischer. Brody is a professor of Latin American history at the University of Chicago and former director of the Center for Latin American Studies there. Her research centers on inequality and its persistence in Brazil, with a focus on informality, cities, law, migration, race, slavery, and its afterlives. Her book, A Poverty of Rights, examines how weak citizenship rights and residential informality came to define urban poverty, popular social struggles, and the political dynamics of inequality in modern Brazil. Brody's study is a foundational work for scholars of 19th and 20th century Latin America. Brody is now working on a new project on Recife, exploring historical coevolution of urbanism and informality. I'm sure she will tell us more about this exciting new research shortly. We are also delighted to have with us today Ada Ferrer as a discussant. Ada is the Dayton Stockton Professor of History here at Princeton. Her most recent book, Cuba, An American History, won the Pulitzer Prize in 2022. She's currently working on a fascinating project that blends history and family memoir to explore the experiences and meanings of revolution and migration. As for the format of today's event, we will first hear from Brody. Following her presentation, Ada will offer some comments and questions to spark the discussion. After Brody's reply, we will open the floor for Q&A. Before we start, I want to acknowledge that this event would not have been possible without the incredible support of Kimberly Biederman and Damaris Zayas. Thank you both for putting this together. Now, with no further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Brody and Ada. Brody.
Thank you. It is such a pleasure to be here, and I'm really grateful to Miqueias and also to the Brazil Lab and to PLAS for the invitation. to all of you for being here, and to Ada Ferrer for reading and commenting. That's a real treat to add on to this. I'm thankful also for the chance this invitation has given me to think with and in honor of Stanley Stein. Vassouras was probably the first history of Brazil that I ever read back in 1988, when it was still a relatively recent work, I suppose. And it remains a scholarly beacon for its empathy, for its methodological heterodoxy, and also for the clear common sense of its implicit historiographical argument, namely that the deep workings of global forces can only really be apprehended at a local scale through patient and imaginative attention to the quotidian interplays of geography and materiality, social relations, and cultural production. That final insight is a direct inspiration for the book in progress that I'll be talking about today, tentatively titled Intimate Inequalities. My book is, in Stein's mid-20th century terms, something of a community study. It focuses on the city of Recife, Brazil, which is right there on the bulge of Brazil, reaching out toward Africa. It's a northeastern Brazilian capital of sugar, also known as a capital of underdevelopment. It was a cradle at once for Brazil's myth of racial democracy and also for some of the country's most radical and emancipatory political ideas. But intimate equality's driving question is, like so many of Stein's questions, at once simpler and more expansive than the community study model might suggest. How, I ask, can we better historicize and thus better understand the sociospatial and socio-racial inequalities that characterize Brazil's modern cities? The answers to that question have led me, not surprisingly, to urban slavery and to the ambiguities of the processes that ended it. My book argues that Brazilian slavery as a system of power and domination was rooted not so much in law as in something that I call relational power, as defined here, a system of vertical ties, both strategic and affective, that permeated Brazil's institutions and systematically limited the power of law qua law. Far from being destroyed by abolition, the relational systems of power that were at the heart of Brazil's urban slavery found new life in freedom, both in the processes through which most enslaved people became free and in the systems of informal governance, again defined here, governance that occurs outside of formal institutional constraints that have shaped Brazilian cities in the 20th century. And informal governance, in turn, is facilitated by the deliberate creation of urban informality, a specific realm in which urbanity is created and regulated beyond law's bounds. A specific realm in which urbanity is created and regulated beyond law's bounds, just to emphasize. Urban informality can be understood in this reading as a crucial afterlife of slavery, as a key mechanism akin to redlining or predatory inclusion in the US, a key mechanism that perpetuated both slavery's inequalities and the forms of struggle that they engendered. So that, in a nutshell, is intimate inequality's analytical argument. But in keeping with Brazilian historiographical traditions that Stanley Stein and his student Rebecca Scott had a strong hand in creating, that argument is inseparable from the methods that I'm using to construct it. Meaning that in this book, I've tried my very best to respect and expand upon a distinctly Brazilian approach to the social history of slavery, one that places a premium on intimacies and on continuities, one that focuses on the archive's noise as much as it recognizes their silence, one that uses cross-referencing techniques and digital archival capabilities to expand what we can know from archival fragments, and one that, above all, takes very seriously the power of storytelling as a form of analysis. In this book, stories, both narrative deep dives and photo mosaics of archival fragments, occupy the most space, and my arguments materialize mostly through reconstructions of lived experience. So in keeping with that method, I'd like to spend the rest of our time together introducing a story, telling a story, and suggesting ever so briefly what that story might mean to its protagonists, its city, and to broader histories of urban slavery and urban freedom in Brazil and around the globe. So let's head back to Recife, seen here in a map circa 1872. I'll begin with a photo that was taken of Recife's 1st of March Street by a German photographer named Moritz Landberg right around 1880. Here, and in this next photo of Recife's so-called New Street, a technical quirk can be read as a metaphor. Because of the camera's long aperture time, Landberg's photos, like practically all the photos that were taken through the 1880s in Recife, his photos capture the street's structure, but erase its people. So, on 1st of March Street, we see an elaborate colonial-era church. We see paved sidewalks. We see multi-story buildings, wrought iron balconies, gas lights. And on the new street, we see hyper-real luminescence. We see a straight row of elegant lampposts, a tram track. But on 1st of March Street, the people, if you can see them at all here, are ghostly. And on the new street, it registers only a single specter, right over on the right-hand side. I'm not even sure you can perceive it here. And this is how it went in 19th and early 20th century Recife, literally in scores of photos that chronicled the city without human beings, and figuratively in a lettered public sphere that glorified urban modernization while barely acknowledging the living, breathing city where tens of thousands of people were doing their very best to build urban lives in the shadow of slavery. So in Recife, we see plenty of this, and also this. But the mud and thatch homes that housed a plurality of Recifenses, or people who lived in Recife, those mud and thatch homes were nowhere, nor were the people who inhabited them, the women, the men, and the children, almost all of them Black. The city portrayed in 19th century photography also erased domestic interiors. There were studio photographs, yes, as Lilia Schwartz has so beautifully shown, photos where photographers and subjects regularly staged domesticity. But we lack even a rudimentary visual record of actual life behind domestic walls, which was every bit as important to the city as what happened in public space. And that is, of course, especially true when it comes to the domestic interiors and domestic lives of Black, poor, and marginalized people, and especially women. So it's easy to see how an urban history based on this visual archive might be deeply distorted. But once we see that, it becomes easier to see as well other kinds of distortions. In urban history, where our archives often omit as much as the photographs do, but also less obviously in the historiography of slavery's abolition. Here, most of the things that what we might call the historiographical camera captures, the equivalent of the solid buildings that we've seen in the photographs, most of these things are landmarks of what happened in the public sphere. The urban social movements that comprised abolitionism were articulated through letters, newspapers, performances, and parliamentary debates. They aimed ultimately at eliminating slavery through formal means, legal emancipation, legal abolition. And they were protagonized by, basically, men in suits and a few very well-dressed women, as portrayed in this image of Fortaleza, Ceará, the capital of the first Brazilian region to eliminate slavery in 1884. And you'll notice the racial composition and the way that these people are dressed. The abolition that this historiographical camera captures can run deeper. Some scholars, like your own Isadora Moura Mota, have shown how abolitionism was catalyzed by the same processes of global modernization that incentivized second slavery. Other historians like Celso Castilho in Recife have shown how abolitionism brought new voices into the modern public sphere. And many other historians, like Sidney Chalubi, have focused on the emancipatory possibilities that the public sphere enabled. So in this reading, the modern city, in its hyper-real iteration, creates anonymity and open labor markets and spaces for bottom-up mobilizations and public institutions like courts where people can claim their rights. Enslaved people could use these things to loosen slavery's bonds, disguising themselves as free people, melting into crowds, and accumulating resources as free laborers, asserting their power through urban protest, and bringing legal suits to claim their freedom. Building through all of this, an oppositional cidade negra, or black city, the self-consciously nurtured black life and culture. Those accounts of black urban life and abolition have brought about a whole generation of social history, of which I'm privileged to consider myself a part. But they also conceal their own ghostly specters. Just as urban modernization coexisted with layer upon layer of other urban ways of being, so the public and oppositional road to abolition coexisted with a tangled web of routes to freedom. And this difficult reality in Recife implies that most of the routes to freedom played out in intimate space, in literal and figurative urban interiors, and were thus structured around the very practices of relational power that also sustained slavery. In other words, the processes through which urban people sought their freedom and built free lives were often the very same ones that incubated slavery's enduring afterlives. That, in essence, is what Intimate Inequalities is all about. How slavery and its brutalities were sustained by relational modes of power that persisted and shaped the cities that emerged in slavery's wake. So at this point, I could continue to describe my book, but since part of its point is to center the people who lived this process and made the choices that shaped it, to show rather than tell, building my arguments from the ground up through their stories, in that spirit, I'd like to spend what remains of our time together simply reading a small section of Intimate Inequalities that centers on a few of the human beings that photographers would have rendered as ghosts. For people who did not come to the city as adults or strangers, Recife was less an open seascape than a tangle of linked interiors. On October 30th, 1883, a teenage girl named Esperanza, or Hope, died in a downtown attic. It was a Tuesday, nearly summer, hot. Esperanza might or might not have sensed the surrounding city as she hung for hours, face down, suspended from the rafters by her wrists and ankles in punishment for a petty domestic theft. Maybe the city's noise drifted that far upward, seagulls squawking, passenger locomotives whistling, carriages rattling, vendors crying. Esperanza's protests might also have traveled through the attic's rustic skylight, unsettling the abolitionist neighbors who had complained before about her suffering, but had never done anything about it. If it hadn't been for those oral witnesses, perhaps Esperanza's mistress, Herculina, would not have strangled her to stifle her cries. Esperanza, recently freed from slavery, might have lived long enough to acquire a last name. But as it was, she was murdered by the same woman who had raised her from birth, taught her to read, manumitted her, and sold her mother south. An image of the crime, which I will not share, comes to us through an anonymous pencil drawing rendered for a criminal judge in 1884. The sketch makes quick work of Esperanza. The attic's rafters are more finely rendered than her face, a hollow-eyed mask. The artist conveys the play of light on her homespun dress but reveals nothing that might distinguish Esperanza from any other girl, defined only by her color and her servile state, erased by the terrible spectacle of her death. This barren depiction should unsettle us. Maybe enough to forget the sketch, delete the lines, begin again. Why risk equating Esperanza's life with the brutality that ended it? And yet, if we're looking for Esperanza, this is the only place we find her. If it hadn't been for the scandal of her death, her erasure would have been complete. In life, she left no trace. No baptism, no writing, no photograph, no possessions, no recorded transaction, no public deed. Esperanza had no known siblings, no children, no nieces, no nephews. It is not clear that anyone ever passed down her memory. Esperanza lived behind domestic windows, in intimate urban spaces that chroniclers didn't bother to describe. Her killing forced openings in that enclosure. A sketch, a map, reams of scribbled testimony, a dozen breathless press accounts, which expose elements of Esperanza's life in order to sort out responsibility for her death. The archive of Esperanza's murder, like all archives, is full of lies and silences. But it's also sloppy and noisy. Powerful actors disagreed. Scribes couldn't tame every tongue, and witnesses let secrets slip. Despite themselves, these grim papers open a small window onto Esperanza's world, a city of interiors, of private relationships, of interconnected, intimate spheres, where freedom, mobility, and survival often hinged on terrible attachments. Read with this in mind, Esperanza's case becomes a grisly opening to the inward dynamics of a city in transition. Focusing on the lives and actions and interactions and circulations and enclosures that Esperanza's murder exposed, we can begin to see the intimate geographies of Recife's urban life as they might have been experienced by people straining to claim urban freedom with full knowledge of their own precarity. And these, in turn, expose how the private relational power that structured slavery's city persisted even as bondage waned, ensuring a long afterlife for Recife's innermost inequalities. So to enter Esperanza's city, we start and end with where she lived, in this house, the white one on the right side of the bridge. She was 14 or 15 in 1883, and she spent her last years in the upper floors of that tall townhouse on the Rua da Aurora, so named because dawn flooded its aristocratic homes with light. Esperanza might have felt that light during her early morning chores, but she woke early each day on a straw mat in a windowless attic room. She shared that space with an elderly enslaved woman from Angola called Marta, and sometimes with a girl named Luzia, who was enslaved by Erculina's sister. Marta smoked a pipe. The smell of tobacco likely hung in the close air. The room was next to the kitchen at the building's western end, open to a rudimentary water closet and a chicken coop in the eaves. At the other extreme of the attic, a sitting room with a small window faced the Capibaribe River. An enslaved teenage boy named Feliz Bino, and I put all of the names on this slide so that you can try to keep track. On the left side is Erculina's family and its associates. The right side are all of the people who tried to help Esperanza or who were enslaved themselves. So an enslaved teenage boy named Feliz Bino, a bit older than Esperanza, also lived in the house and would have visited the garret along with his older brother Vicente, whom Erculina rented for hire in Greater Recife. Other servants and enslaved people may have come and gone, along with Erculina's siblings. None of these people were strangers. Most had known each other since birth or early childhood, and they were locked in a Slavocratic family network that circulated constantly among rural plantations and city homes. The younger slaves and servant may have been blood relatives. Feliz Bino and Esperanza, both mixed race, may have actually been fathered by their mothers enslavers. As household cria, or children who were raised to serve, they had lived together through the sale of Esperanza's mother and many others who were part of a forced migration to Brazil's southeastern coffee fields that tore tens of thousands of enslaved people from their families in the 1860s and 1870s. They would also have been each other's companions and conduits, passing on bits of news or gossip culled from street encounters or lines at the water pump, relaying urgent messages to friends and families separated by sale or displacement, giving legs to rumors based on overheard conversations or news articles left within sight of literate slaves. If one of them wanted to sell something or take on paid work or squirrel away resources or reach out to an emancipation society or run away, they would have relied on those subterranean networks. If anyone ever participated in Afro-Brazilian religious rites or took part in popular Saints' Day celebrations in Recife's suburbs, or simply wanted to flirt or drink or sing or dance, this extended household web would have helped all of that happen. Yet the household cria and slaves also fought bitterly, both as families do and because their owners and employers pitted them against one another, forcing them to compete for small privileges and gradations of freedom. According to Marta's testimony, Lucia and Esperanza were always squabbling, though Esperanza nearly always slipped away triumphantly because she was cleverer. Who would avoid the dirtiest tasks? Who would learn to read? Who would have new clothes or shoes? Who could roam the streets unbound, earning money on the side? Who would work for hire, living as free? Who would be manumitted? Who would be sold south? These gradated freedoms and oppressions were a long-established component of slave discipline in Brazil, atomizing potential solidarities and channeling currents of rebellion towards small, attainable emancipations and protections. Forced complicity and violence enhanced this fragmentation. Herculina compelled the people she enslaved to beat and torture each other, and to demonstrate their loyalty by remaining silent about what they did or saw or heard. Herculina often called on Felizbino to perform the labor of her torture, as he did on October 30th. The other slaves might have known that immoderate punishment was actually illegal and an abolitionist cause célèbre, but they also knew that gradated freedoms required silence and complicity. Mutual support always coexisted with personal discord, forced complicity, and the race for small freedoms, complicated, as intended, collective action. Esperanza and the other occupants of the attic spent their days navigating those realities, all the while serving the needs and the whims of a crowded, fluid household on the unstable edges of bourgeois respectability. Herculina was the 50-year-old daughter of a large and regionally prominent, but downwardly mobile sugar family. Her father was a well-known coronel, or rural boss, connected to Pernambuco's Liberal Party, which was generally the party that favored freedom. Herculina and her husband may have been estranged, and their grown son, Leonardo, was often at the Rua da Aurora, although he did not live there. Day to day, the house was also occupied by 3 student boarders from the nearby law school, and also by Herculina's 2 younger sisters, whose frequent extended stays included their children and the people they enslaved. Work in this house was never scarce. The labor of cooking for the family and the boarders took place in the attic. Someone had to fetch fuel and clean the stove. Someone had to purchase food from local vendors or the central market just across the river. The house may have had piped water, but Felizbino also went to fetch it at a public pump on the day of Esperanza's death. He or others might also have had to dispose of human waste on a daily basis. But Esperanza, who was brought up with indulgence as well as violence, avoided the heaviest and most degrading work. Though she still served the house and lived in slave quarters, Esperanza had been freed, unconditionally, according to Herculina, and very unusually, both Esperanza and Felizbino had been taught to read. Day to day, Esperanza cooked and attended to Herculina's household and tidied the crowded common spaces filled with furniture of rattan and jacaranda, mirrors, an expandable dining table and sidebar, formal china, silverware, endless cups and glasses, clothing, hats, perhaps some paintings or vases, and a few treasured ornaments, watches, or jewelry. There were probably books, at least a few. But given Ercolina's apparent economic straits, these things were likely very carefully conserved. Esperanza washed them and dusted them and sewed them and repaired them, and she was also, fatally it turns out, held to account if they were lost or broken. The flip side of indulgence was enclosure. Marta and Victor were rented out to other masters in Greater Recife. Felizbino went to the market and brought lunch to Ercolina's son. Luzia went on errands and circulated unaccounted for through the city streets. None of these outings implied full independence. In close-knit Recife, everyone was always within a few degrees of recognition. But they were chinks in the domestic walls, openings to an urban world where opportunities for freedom were always just below the surface. In June of 1883, in answer to a classified ad, someone offered 100,000 mil reis to complete an enslaved person's freedom. To claim it, that person had only to show up personally just next door at the Rua da Aurora, number 67. Maybe Marta or Victor or Felizbino were that person, or maybe they knew them. Maybe they gained some small footholds in other networks of protection and power, or maybe they worked for cash on the side or gained new skills, or maybe they found time for drink or flirtation, or even slipped off to gatherings in small quilombos, mocambos, or tenements. Maybe they knew that meetings of a local emancipationist society happened just a few doors down, or that Ercolina's downstairs neighbor was the mother-in-law of a daring abolitionist who ran Recife's Underground Railroad. Maybe Marta and Victor or Felizbino took part in the abolitionist activism that was erupting across the city in those years. These passages might have just been enough to link them to the Cidade Negra, the Black City, the wider chain of enslaved and freed people who used the city to create solidarity and community and freedom beyond the families that bound them. But Esperanza, who was favored and freed, she left no hint of ever grasping that chain. She probably learned something about Recife as she went about her work. If there were newspapers, she could read them, and if the student boarders debated politics or abolition, she could hear them. Yet unlike other girls in her situation, she did not answer classified ads for cooks and laundresses. She did not run away with a boy to start her own household. She didn't even seem to have contact with a woman named Maria Rosario, her great aunt and only known relative, who was reduced to asking after Esperanza whenever she happened to meet household slaves or servants on the street. Why? Given Ercolina's violence, brutality, and its threat, those might have been the full answer. Maybe coercion or strategy also played a role. Ercolina might have lied about freeing Esperanza unconditionally, or perhaps somebody else's freedom hinged on her staying in the household. Esperanza, smart as she was, might have realized that escape was actually rather futile. Recife was a city where everyone was eventually recognized, and no one of her status found a place without a patron. Perversely, part of the explanation might also have been affective. Whatever else, Ercolina's household in Recife and her kin network throughout Pernambuco were what Esperanza knew. Because of her enclosure, Esperanza's mental map probably traced Ercolina's family archipelago. Ercolina herself may also have justified Esperanza's confinement, and Esperanza might have even accepted it through a logic of honor. Many of Recife's domestic servants would only consent to work within their employer's walls, and respectable families confined decent girls to protect them from seduction, perhaps especially if the girls themselves read seduction as freedom. Even young women who never left their homes were subject to harsh moral discipline. Just a few months before Esperanza's death, a paid notice appeared in a local newspaper detailing how an anonymous mulachinha, who may even have been Esperanza herself, who lived on the Rua da Aurora, was brutally whipped for coming to a window by night to converse with a hapless Portuguese charlatan who was wooing her in the rain beneath the gamalera trees on the banks of the Capibaribe River. If Esperanza left the house, she did it fleetingly, in service, under supervision, or in secret. So in life, Esperanza left few clues as to how the city of Recife might have touched her. In the hundreds of pages that document her murder, there are only 3 traces of any purposeful action. Esperanza stole habitually, lifting a bit of lace and a gold pince-nez and hiding them beneath a trunk on the day that she died. She also screamed as she underwent habitual beatings, so much so that the abolitionist downstairs neighbors shouted uselessly for Erculina to stop. And once, she leaned out the 3rd-floor window and deliberately spit as one of those abolitionist neighbors passed by on the street below. Stealing, screaming, and spitting. This is not much from which to reconstitute a thinking, feeling human, or the city that she experienced and imagined. Yet each of these actions hints at a map of urban possibility. Esperanza might have stolen in order to pawn the items and purchase her mother's freedom, relying on urban networks capable of making illicit objects into merchandise and dirty money clean. She probably screamed to call public attention to Erculina's abuse and to bring her life into the public sphere. Maybe Esperanza spit in futile resentment of her neighbor's hypocritical passivity, or maybe it was just a prank. Either way, the action placed Esperanza in one of the urban windows that you have before you. A clever, willful girl, perhaps bored, perhaps angry, perhaps spiteful, watching the city go by. Paradoxically, Esperanza's death etched her into the urban archive much more surely than her life ever did. Defunct, her body left the townhouse, and the story of her murder traveled the whisper network of slaves and servants. The facts of her case entered the public record, and the fate of her murderer became a matter of public justice and public furor. And then, just as surely, the silent and subterranean circuits of private power hollowed out that public action, reaffirming, even in death, Esperanza's intimate constraints. Esperanza's murder first played out in silence. She died strangled on that spring Tuesday of 1883, still hanging from her wrists and ankles, sometime after Felizbino left for the market around 12 p.m. Marta, who spent her day in the attic, and Lucia, who was cooking in the adjoining kitchen, claimed improbably that they saw and heard nothing. Esperanza, according to them, had not made a single sound. Felizbino, returning around 2 p.m., found Esperanza motionless, still suspended, her head cradled in her arms. He released her and lay her face down on the ground. Lucia alerted Erculina, who came lumbering up to the attic. She asked that Esperanza be turned on her back and then, quote unquote, looked at her for a moment without saying a single word, and then left. The 3 student boarders climbed to the garret and verified the death. All later testified that they too heard and saw nothing. At about 3:30, Erculina's grandchild was sent to fetch Dr. Antonio da Arruda Beltrão, a family friend and neighbor. By the time he arrived, Esperanza had been covered by a cloth, and Erculina and her sisters said that she had died of intestinal colic. Because twilight left the attic ill-lit, and because, in his own words, she was black, Dr. Beltrão, after verifying through the makeshift shroud that Esperanza's heart no longer beat, accepted the diagnosis and provided a death certificate. At some point in that afternoon, Lucia dressed Esperanza's body in a cotton shirt, a calico skirt, and a headscarf that was tied below the chin. Dona Erculina's adult son, Leonardo, sent Felizbino to summon the local funeral service, and a cart appeared to take Esperanza's body away for a lonely burial and in a slave's grave. If these events had taken place in one of Ercolina's family homes in the countryside, Esperanza's story might have ended there. Another black girl disappeared. But the Rua da Aurora No. 3 was not entirely enclosed. Death or no death, Felizbino and Luzia found reasons to leave the house. By evening, Esperanza's story had traveled from mouth to mouth among enslaved people and servants. Though Felizbino later denied it, he related the news to Maria do Rosario, Esperanza's great aunt, whom he met after dark on the elegant Boa Vista Bridge that you see before you, adjacent to the Rua da Aurora No. 3. And this was a fateful encounter. Maria do Rosario was a widowed freedwoman who may have been keyed into one of the most important black networks in 19th century Recife. Although she described herself as stunned by the news, Maria do Rosario responded with action. She first set off in search of advice from a comadre near the church of São Gonçalo, a few blocks southwest. Not finding her, she may have spoken briefly with an unknown bearded man in a nearby alley. And then, at the doorway of the Gloria convent, Maria do Rosario's purposeful itinerary of grief found its port of call. A carpenter named Oton Alves Pessoa, on patrol as a civilian block inspector, heard her telling of the murder and reported it to a local police authority, active in liberal and abolitionist causes. Oton then summoned Maria do Rosario to the police chief's home. Esperanza's death, at that moment, emerged from whispers and was now a matter of public record. Upon hearing the accusation, Police Chief José Climaco do Espírito Santo, a polemic figure active in liberal party politics and quick to publicly denounce enslavers' abuses, moved swiftly. He and the station chief tracked down Esperanza's body around midnight, which was hard going because she'd been misclassified as a slave and left in the wrong part of the public cemetery. The following day, Climaco returned by daylight to the cemetery with Dr. Beltrão, who, horrified, he claimed, at Ercolina's deception, re-examined the body, documenting bloody bruises on Esperanza's face and deep fingernail gashes on her throat. She had died, he now certified, of strangulation. Climaco then called in Maria and Luzia and Felizbino, even though their enslaved status technically compromised their standing as witnesses. Marta said nothing, but Felizbino and Luzia both confirmed, at least that once, that Ercolina had murdered Esperanza. Cheered on by a street crowd, police arrested and imprisoned Ercolina and Felizbino on November 2nd, an unsurprising fate for Felizbino, but one almost unheard of for a señora of Ercolina's family status. Ercolina's lawyer mounted a vigorous press campaign and assembled a throng of sobbing society women and respectable neighbors, including a noted abolitionist, to plead Ercolina's innocence. But Climaco ignored all that. His investigative report drove its case to its logical conclusion, delivering a blistering condemnation of Ercolina as a murderess and Felizbino as her forced accomplice. He dismissed Ercolina and her household as liars, caustically noting that the supposedly ignorant slaves, quote-unquote brutalized by their state, produced testimony that was perfectly coherent and harmonious with the physical evidence, while Ercolina's free household proved their mendacity by contradicting each other at every turn. And remarkably, a judge denied Ercolina's appeal for habeas corpus on the basis of that report, as crowds packed the tribunal, and she received Climaco's recommendation for indictment from prison on December 1st. So for that brief moment, Esperanza's case was wrenched from its intimate confines. Perhaps she actually belonged to a public world beyond her household, after all. Yet just as quickly, the corrosive power of relationships and influence slowed Climaco's momentum. Judge after judge after judge recused himself because of personal connections with the family. Ercolina's habeas corpus request was actually granted on appeal in early December. Free from prison and begging illness, she never returned to court and finally disappeared entirely. Sightings of her occasionally surfaced, but the rumor was that a group of men, dressed in the typical leather garb of the northeastern interior, had spirited her away by night to a family compound. The court, meanwhile, denied Felisbino's habeas corpus request on the grounds that he was a slave and he had no right to public protection. In ways that we can easily imagine, Ercolina and her family imposed silence on their household slaves. Lucia, upon whose testimony the case depended, disappeared entirely. Wild rumors circulated about her fate. She might have been freed or run away to the newly free territory of Ceará. She might have died of smallpox at the city hospital. She might have been taken forcibly to the family engenho. But in any case, she never testified. Marta refused to talk, and even Felisbino and Maria do Rosario equivocated in the end. Felisbino's brother Vicente, still enslaved by Ercolina, visited his brother in prison, but he would not testify. And while both Felisbino and Dona Ercolina were eventually indicted by a jury, only Felisbino actually faced a trial. He was condemned to 80 lashes and 6 months of irons around his neck. Ercolina, an outraged reporter noted, was never tried. The law left her, in the reporter's words, wandering freely, covered, protected, given refuge in places where justice still has not penetrated because it does not wish to do so, because the worst kind of blindness is that which does not wish to see. There was a kind of coda. Felisbino's conviction became an abolitionist cause célèbre at the height of the movement's fervor. How, the papers asked, could Felisbino, a slave, a mere automaton, be held responsible by a civilized people when the real murderess went free? Accordingly, an appeals court absolved Felisbino in 1887. But what did they do? They released him, still enslaved, to Ercolina's family. Such one vindication did nothing to alter what Esperanza's life, death, and afterlife had shown about the nature of freedom in a city structured by relational bounds. What held Esperanza in place, what structured her enclosure in Ercolina's household, what kept her from leaving even after she was nominally free, what withered her recoverable agency to stealing and screaming and spitting, what held her back was not the law of slavery, but the violent, unregulated force of intimate coercion. What muffled Recife's emancipatory possibilities was not the absence of urban forms and institutions, but rather their saturation with the logic of favor, connection, and hierarchy. A few years before Esperanza's murder, our German photographer friend, Moritz Lamberg, likely captured the view from Ercolina's building, which you can see in this photo. We can only speculate how this happened. Maybe someone from the building sat for a carte de visite at Lamberg's nearby studio. Maybe Felisbino or Victor or Marta or Lucia were models for that studio's haunted collection of so-called Negro types. But regardless, to compose this urban scene before you, Lamberg's camera seemingly stared from Ercolina's confines. When Esperanza leaned out the window to spit, this is what she saw. The Boa Vista Bridge, constructed in 1874 with English wrought iron, the Gamaleira trees reflecting on the Capibaribe River, the tightly packed buildings lining the Rua Nova, and the cupolas of Nossa Senhora da Conceição and Santo Antonio. On this bridge's wooden planks, Felisbino told Maria Rosario that her niece had been killed. And from across the river, neighbors would have seen as the funeral cart came to spirit Esperanza's body to a slave's grave, or as crowds rallied to cheer Ercolina's arrest. What we know of Esperanza and Felisbino and Lucia and Marta dissolves the silences of Moritz's genre. The camera's omnipotent eye may have captured only forms and structures, but our knowledge of Ercolina's home, the very space in which Moritz might have stood to capture his image, perhaps holding a cup of coffee served by Esperanza herself, that jolts us to imagine what the photograph erased. From the Rua da Aurora No. 3 and some 20,000 other households across Recife, people whose lives had been shaped by slavery and subordination, people who were enslaved or freed or born free, all of them stared out not only at buildings and streets, but also at people who inhabited those streets and the relationships that both sparked and snuffed out the possibilities of urban life. And in each one of those gazes, at each intersection of intimacy and public life, we can begin to grasp the forces that shaped the city in the flux of slavery's final decades. We can see that apparent modernization, changes in the world of work, the reach of law, and the possibilities of manumission and citizenship, modernization was not enough to snap the threads of slavery's social web. And we can see also how the city's institutional structures were haunted and infused by the logics of informal relational governance, the same logics that comprise slavery's most consequential afterlives. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Brody. I was very excited when Micaeus asked me to do the comment on this paper. For many reasons, I've long been a fan of Brody's work. Her book, A Poverty of Rights on 20th Century Rio, is not directly connected to my own work, but on reading it, I very much valued its arguments and contributions about ideas about the law and informality. In particular, that book showed how elites crafted laws that they knew would be widely broken and that they had no power to enforce universally. But ironically, the absence of that power to enforce gave elites a very different and perhaps more powerful power, and that is the power to decide who would be held to the law and who wouldn't. The power to decide whose crime would be met by a blind eye and whose would be met by the hand of punishment. Poor, marginalized people also made use of informality, Brody shows, to claim space in the city of Rio, say. Yet that informality at the same time rendered them extremely vulnerable, always outside the law and never knowing if and when it might be brought to bear on them. So Brody's work in that first book showed magnificently how that built-in informality explains structural inequalities and the persistence of structural inequalities. It explains how even radical transformations, revolutions say, or the abolition of slavery, can be substantially undermined. That important argument, I know, and I believe fervently, has resonances far and wide beyond Rio or the 20th century. And as a scholar of slavery myself, I was excited to see how Brody's new work would deploy and extend some of those arguments into her new work on slavery and emancipation. And I will just pronounce that I have not been the least bit disappointed. Brody's chapter and larger book project from which we heard today focuses on the city of Recife in northeastern Brazil, and her temporal focus begins with the waning decades of slavery, the moment of emancipation in 1888, and then abolition's aftermath roughly to the 1920s. There is, of course, a vast literature on Brazilian slavery, on comparative slavery, as well as on the law of slavery, which has come up today a few times. And scholars in all these fields recognize the gray areas between freedom and slavery. For instance, the ways that the enslaved could use the law to push and make claims for freedoms large and small, the ways masters violated the law with impunity, or the way even free people could be vulnerable to a re-enslavement that was perpetrated through the collusion of masters and the legal system. When slavery scholars study emancipation, likewise, they focus on freedom not just as law and not just as the absence of slavery, but on freedom as a system in itself, a system, say, in which people have to sell their labor. So historians have approached the end of slavery as a dynamic process, And in the boom of post-emancipation studies that began in the 1980s, historians focused especially on the formerly enslaved and on the ways in which they struggled mightily to give meaning to their freedom. Freedom was, as Barbara Fields shows decades ago, always a moving target. These kinds of observations and arguments are things that we see in Brodie's work today. But Brodie goes significantly further. She shows that while that general picture that I've just painted of how the historiography approaches slavery and emancipation, while that picture is true, it still misses something very important. And what it misses, what it elides, in fact, is precisely the significance of informality embedded in dense interpersonal relations. Slavery and the law of slavery, Brodie shows, are always embedded in dense interpersonal relations that are hierarchical, vertical, sometimes horizontal, sometimes even intimate. A single household might be home to enslaved individuals and to others recently freed but still living there. Among those enslaved and those formerly enslaved, networks of solidarity emerged. But those networks did not always preclude rivalries and conflicts over access to gradations of freedom or protection. Within the same families, there were people of different statuses, and even individual persons lived lives that sometimes crossed the boundaries of slavery and freedom. People who sometimes acquired their freedom, people illegally re-enslaved, people once free in Africa landed as unfree in Brazil. To divide the world into slave and free is important and necessary, but it is also never enough, today's paper shows, because it misses the ways that this tangled web of cross-cutting networks can both and at the same time highlight the existence of difference and blur its very boundaries. Day-to-day experiences of slavery and freedom also go beyond the practices dictated by law. The law might dictate one thing, but practice produce another. And in that informal reality that remains somehow always beyond, but alongside the law, many people were complicit. Enslaved could ignore or be forced to ignore violations of the law by masters to protect themselves. Committed and local abolitionists who could hear neighbors illegally torturing their enslaved could decide, based on their interpersonal relations, to do nothing about that, despite the law and despite their supposed convictions. A child could be born to an enslaved mother after the Free Womb Law of 1871, yet the master could still treat that child as his slave, whether by inflicting punishment or coercing labor from them, or even separating them from their mothers, the law notwithstanding. Here then, in Brodie's work, is revealed a mode of power that is informal, relational, and always there, just below the surface. In Brodie's work, however, that power is never abstract. In this particular presentation we saw today, it is embodied in the story of the life and the 1883 murder of a young freed girl named Esperanza. Esperanza's life cannot be understood without taking into account that informal relational power. The fact that Herculina, the woman who murdered her, acted as Esperanza's master or mistress, despite the legal fact that Esperanza was free. That before the murder, that same white woman habitually beat Esperanza, again, despite the fact that the girl was free, and that by then the law made such punishment illegal, even for those who were enslaved. The murder and the state's action in its aftermath also reveal the exercise of that same mode of power. The state imprisoned an enslaved boy, Felispino, who the mistress forced to be complicit in Esperanza's murder. Meanwhile, it ended up doing little, if anything at all, after Herculina disappeared, to bring the murderer to justice. In the broader book, Brodie expands and multiplies Esperanza's story by many others, to show a clear pattern of how informality and interpersonal relations were absolutely central to when, how, and if the law operated. In the process, Brodwyn gives us new insights into the histories of slavery, of freedom, and of the forces that blocked the emancipatory promise of that moment. The forces that limited access to full citizenship, and that became, in effect, an always essential part of the afterlife of slavery and the persistence of structural inequalities and oppressions after. So based on what we saw today, the book, and I'll say the book, is beautifully rendered and written and argued and provocative, and I think as impactful as her first book was. So I cannot wait to read the book and actually to assign it. But I want to just throw out, without taking too much time, a few questions for you. So because the part of the book that you focused on today is set right before emancipation, I wondered about what informality looks like in the aftermath of freedom. One object of study here is the law itself. What happens after the one-sentence law that eliminates slavery? Does that law change the way informality worked? You argued, of course, that the informality continues to operate, and that's partly what's so path-breaking about the book. But I wondered what difference, if any, did freedom make to how this mode of power operated? The second question has to do with something that was very present in Brodwyn's talk and that I have not yet mentioned at all in my comment, and that is the fact that Brodwyn's is an urban history. You situate your story and your theory about informal relational power in the streets and alleyways and waterfronts of Recife. Yet for me, part of the power of your theory is that it also explains so much about rural slavery and freedom as well. So I wondered specifically what makes this an urban story for you. Is the city a condition or a shaper of this exercise of power? Are the rural outskirts of Recife part of your analysis? And how might the Recife's connection, the city's connections to its hinterland and to rural slavery, in fact, make possible the kinds of things you're seeing in the city? And here I'm thinking of Erica Armstrong Dunbar's amazing book, Never Caught, on George Washington, of all things. Not maybe someone you hear about often in class, but she tells this amazing story about a woman held as enslaved by George and Martha Washington when they're living in Philadelphia. And of course, in the city of Philadelphia, if any slave who spends more than 6 months in Philadelphia becomes free. So the very cunning George Washington and his wife Martha, just before those 6 months were up, would always send Ona to the country. And by that way, George Washington avoided ever losing access to the slave. So it's this kind of, it's a story in a sense about the malleability of law, the manipulation of law, the imperfect exercise and application of it, but it's also a story that to work depends on the connections between city and countryside, between rural slavery and urban slavery. So I wonder to what extent that's present here, or how you think about the question about whether this is only or primarily an urban story. And then finally, my third and last question is a methodological one. I love the emphasis on storytelling and on storytelling as a mode of analysis. I think it's fantastic. And I imagine, and as is often the case with this kind of storytelling, it requires the historian to build stories out of fragments, to piece together the different archival fragments, and as you said in your introduction, use other methods and other kinds of sources to build around it. So in the hundreds of pages that you found on Esperanza's murder, you say that there are just 3 mentions that capture her engaging in purposeful action. When she is beaten, which she is habitually, but yet yells loudly enough to disturb the neighbors. when she steals a few things from her mistress the day of her murder, and then the day that she leans out her window to spit at maybe those same neighbors, I can't now remember. So the absence of her actions, the absence of her thoughts, of her feelings in the record, nudge you to speculate about what might have been some of her experiences, some of her actions, some of her reasons for this and that. Maybe she stole the items to pawn them and earn money towards her mother's freedom, for instance. There are, in fact, in that part of the paper, a lot of maybes and a lot of probablys. So I have a set of questions about that. Knowing your work, as I do, I know that the maybes that are here are not the result of pure speculation, but rather of deeply informed speculation honed from decades of working in mountains, maybe literal, no, not literal, maybe metaphorical mountains of always stubborn and always unruly archival sources. Still, I note that I wonder if there's a practice to the maybes, if there's a pattern to the maybes. There are places where you don't engage in maybes. For example, when the crowd cheers the arrest of Ercolina, you don't engage there. There are maybes that you do engage, why Esperanza stole, why she might have spit, etc. There are maybes where there are sometimes lists of maybes to speculate on a particular question, but then they always stop at a certain point. So is there a pattern to where you spot? Are there places that you don't go? So really, but the underlying question there is maybe, it is how does one decide when a maybe is appropriate or helpful and when it isn't? How many maybes may be too distracting to the reader? How many maybes become disruptive of the storytelling that tries to draw attention to the people who are your protagonists? How many maybes are maybe just a little too much? That's the question. C.L.R. James, in 1971, giving a speech and looking back on his 1938 masterpiece, The Black Jacobins, said, quote, speculative thought is important. And unless you are doing speculative thought, you are not doing any thought at all. You are just playing about, end quote. So taking that to heart, knowing that the most interesting questions are always the ones that will elude answers, understanding and sharing your insistence on asking those questions anyway, even though we will never have full answers. We insist on asking them because we get to places that we otherwise wouldn't, I think. So knowing all that, I just wonder if there are other ways other than the persistent maybes to convey the uncertainty, the engagement with the unknown and unknowable that is always necessary in a history of this kind. So I'll just stop there.
Yeah.
So I just want to begin by saying thank you. That was one of the most beautiful readings I've ever heard somebody give of my work, and I really appreciate it. And I think in my very first class that I taught as an assistant professor at Amherst College, I taught your first book from Cuba, and I've been reading you ever since. And it's really, and as the wife of a Cuban, your recent work has also touched us all very deeply. So it's really wonderful to hear that reading, and also just to feel so entirely understood. It's really appreciated. So the questions are wonderful, and I'm not going to claim that I have an easy answer to the harder among them. Maybe I'll start with the last one, because I think that's in some ways the hardest. I mean, I think that as an editorial matter, you're probably right that there is a moment when too many maybes are too many maybes. But I think the question goes beyond an editorial question, because it's really a question about what it is that we're doing when we speculate about something that we can't absolutely know. And I think Ada is right that there is a pattern in the maybes, because as much as I like to talk about noisy archives, I think that there is, it's not really a disagreement, I wouldn't even say. I think that those of us that work with Roman law systems work with a different kind of archive than most people who work with Anglo-American slavery. And I think it's really difficult to convey across that line just the richness and the noisiness of the archives that we work with. There really is an awful lot to go by. And so I very much believe in trying to work through that noise before we sort of talk about the silences. But at the same time, I think that, what the maybes mark is that if what you want to understand is someone's subjective understanding of their life, and if you want to understand their politics and the way that they would express what they think and what they feel and how they want to change their world, that's what's almost impossible to ever find with these kinds of people. It really is not there. And so usually when I use a maybe, I use it because I've seen another situation where somebody like this person did that thing or thought that thing, and so I see it as within the possibilities of what somebody like that living in that world from all of the thousands of other cases really that I've looked at might have done. And whenever I feel like I have enough grounds to do so, I'll sort of venture some kind of possibility. Or maybe there's a hint of it in the case that isn't really solid enough that I feel like I can say it as something that I would trust entirely. So partly I'm doing that, but partly I'm also sort of trying to mark the silences. I mean, I think that what I take away from the debates about the silences of the archives more than anything else, well, many things, but more than anything else, is that a history is really incomplete when you don't mark what you can't know, because that would be the part of anybody else's story. It would be part of what you would write about somebody who was lettered and left diaries and left a much more kind of conscious rendering of the world as they saw it. So that's the purpose. But I agree with you that I think there's a kind of writerly problem in the sense that it can sound kind of fanciful, it can sound kind of foolish, it can, there are lots of things about it that as a writer you feel unsatisfied writing that way. At the same time, I certainly don't feel like I'm in any position to go about something that is more surely speculative in the way Sadia Hartman might do, for example. I don't feel like I, and perhaps anyone really, has the positionality to be able to write the kind of history that I'm writing in that way. And so I think that what I take from your comment is a need to be more attentive to perhaps different ways that I can express that that's what I'm doing in those places. But it is a challenge, because if you bring in the evidence that makes you think all of those maybes, then it burdens the text, it drags it down, it finds a way. And so I think it's not something that I really have a solution to, but I'm grateful for the signaling, because I think it is a real issue. The other questions are things that are a little bit easier to go through, and maybe I'll just do it all in reverse order. So the question about urban history and what makes this an urban history, and what the rural connections mean. So Recife at the time, which actually I can, let me see. I'm going to bring you back to the map, because I think that you can really see on this map what I mean by this. So on this map, you'll see that the urban core of Recife is just that little bit down in the left-hand corner, right? It's 2 islands, which is where the city originated, and then a tiny little band that's along the coastline of the river. And that is really the only area of Recife that would have been recognized by a European person as being urban. That is, if we think of urban as a place where there are solid buildings and paved streets and, all the things that go with North Atlantic urban modernity, that was urban. And if you look at the slightly shaded areas further up, those are actually speculation. Those are like the imaginings of how you might develop the land speculation. So you'll see it all on a grid pattern. That never happened. The city was never developed that way. But what you don't see in the shading is that so much of this land was actually occupied by the kinds of wattle and daub and thatch roofed homes that I showed at the very beginning. And so there's a much denser population even when you get out of that immediate area than you would see here, but it just wasn't recognized as being real. And in fact, on the postcard that was at the very beginning here, this is a postcard from the early 20th century of houses in that kind of area. And at the bottom, it was written for Europeans, black people's houses, right? That's what they called them. And I've looked at city maps where somebody will go with this kind of map that doesn't mark the presence of those homes,
And they actually filled them in with little X's because they couldn't actually do any urban engineering without knowing where those people lived, right? And so they would actually put them and they mark them again, black people's houses is always how they express what these places are. And so in some ways, the urban part of the city extends further than what you can see on this map and what was understood through that North Atlantic lens. But it also really blends into the surrounding countryside. And one of the things that I think all of us realize when we're working on a 19th century port city is that these cities only really exist as the intersection of rural worlds. They have no reason to be a city except that they are the intersection of those rural worlds. And that's true not just economically, but also in terms of the educational institutions that defined Recife. It had one of the only law schools in Brazil, and so it had a lot of status as a city because of that. But all that meant is that people went to Recife to encounter each other, but all of them had their family and their economic base in rural areas. And so there was this constant circulation between rural areas and urban areas. And so in some ways to sort of talk about a rural-urban divide in this time is sort of absurd. And actually, I've often thought Neil Brenner, who some of you might know, a sociologist who works on contemporary sociology, he has a set of very influential ideas about planetary urbanism and the idea that the urban has this impact far beyond what the urban actually is. And I think in a way, both that is true in the 19th century, but also the reverse, that the rural reaches into the urban and the urban reaches into the rural in ways that we really can't sort of demarcate where the border is. So certainly everything that I'm talking about was part of the rural world as well as the urban. But the reason that I focus on the urban is because the urban is such a metonym for modernization. I mean, for the idea of the whole set of isms that we still sort of, as much as we've been beat on the head with the idea that all of these are hyper-real ideas along Dipesh Chakrabarty's lines, that never existed anywhere, even in Europe, but we still carry within our heads all of these scripts of urbanity that are about liberalism, and they're about economic modernization, they're about development. All of those things are sort of cited in cities. And so what to me makes Recife such an interesting city is that it was the third largest city in Brazil, and it remained a really important city all the way through the 20th century. But it's a place where you can see these rural and urban connections so much more clearly than you can in others. And it's a place where that kind of hybrid urbanity, the kind of wattle and daub huts, those were the majority of domiciles in Recife until the end of the 20th century. And so they weren't an exception. That was urbanity. That's what it was about. And so the interesting thing about Recife is that you can see much more than, say, Sao Paulo. You can see sort of the operation of what is kind of ambiguous about that divide. But I completely agree with you that both the system of relational power that undergirds slavery, but also the forms of resistance to it, a lot of those come from the countryside. And even later in the 20th century, when people begin to try to use the law for land claims, a lot of that knowledge came from the country, not from the city. And so these circulations really make a difference in urban life in important ways. So a great question, and much more to say there, but that's there. But then the last question about whether freedom matters and what happens after 1888. So one of the things that I couldn't say in the talk, but which is certainly one of the most important things to know about 19th century Brazilian slavery, is that most of it was illegal by Brazil's own laws. And so not just exceptionally illegal, but 750,000 people were brought to Brazil against Brazil's own laws by the very same people that were writing those laws, and at the time that Brazil's legal system was being formed. And so that kind of fundamental fact that the formers of the law were writing into the legal structure a way to legalize the illegal, to find a way to land illegally enslaved people at their plantations and meld them into a larger enslaved population that was recognized as being enslaved and in fact was certified as being enslaved by the Free Womb Law in 1871. The fact that was happening in the 19th century meant that this idea of sort of finding exception in the law was originally created not necessarily to make people vulnerable in the way that you described at the beginning, but rather the opposite, that powerful people were always in violation of the law,
And the political system was made to make them vulnerable, actually, and to make them, and to rope them into a network of imperial power by the fact that they were constantly doing things that were illegal that could only be held up by relational power, right? And so that as a system sort of existed before. And what you see after abolition, it's not that freedom doesn't matter. I mean, people struggle mightily to become free. They save, I mean, I have some cases where people have like various forms of currency that come from, 50 years of the history of Brazilian currency in the 19th century. And that is their savings that they use to pay for their freedom. That gives you kind of a material sense of just what freedom meant to people. They saved, there was an enormous sort of transfer of wealth from enslaved people to enslavers when most people crossed the line from slavery to freedom in the 1870s and 80s, because the majority of people bought their freedom. They didn't get it any other way. And so freedom meant something to people, and certainly being able to leave, in theory, meant something, and people took advantage of that. But what didn't change is that without relational power, you couldn't do much of anything. You couldn't get a job, you couldn't get housing. And after abolition, Brazil's ex-Slavocratic classes were really masters at using the law to create the kind of power that they themselves had been enmeshed in. And so what they did was create this whole ream of urban regulations that even antedated what I wrote about in A Poverty of Rights, that they knew were just completely absurd given the way that an actual city lived. The majority of people lived in a kind of housing that was illegal. And so if you go to the archives of legislators or municipal government in Recife, basically all it is letters asking for exception. That's what you find, just reams and reams and reams of people asking as a favor that they be allowed to live in the only home that they can afford and the only home that they have. And so it's a system where this kind of dependency on grace you never see anybody saying that they're creating it for that reason, but it's so systemic and it's so understood as the way that power works that you have to understand it as a system that is being created in order to sort of knit people into these vertical hierarchies that really condition the kind of freedom and the kind of especially political independence that they're able to create. And so what people do within that, they don't just roll over. They're not just, and this is where the older Brazilian historiography that deals with this often paints this as a kind of complete weakness on the part of the people that are at the bottom of the social scale. And it's not that at all. They're expert at using these things to build their lives. And if we think about people building their lives rather than resisting or rather than being sort of heroic, but if we think of the goal as building a free life, people did it magisterially with those kinds of tools. And that's kind of what the rest of the book is about, is how people use those tools to do that. But at the same time that they're securing a home, a job, education for their school, for their children, any of those things, at the same time that they're doing that, they're always owing somebody a favor. It's always in the system where there's this kind of back and forth. And so what that means isn't that people don't finally become free. It's that it takes a lot of generations, and especially a lot of women's labor within those generations, to create the possibility of the kinds of grades of freedom that we recognize as freedom in the end of the 20th century. So it's not that it doesn't happen, but that it's really built in this kind of slow and painstaking and compromised way that we have a hard time recognizing as social struggle because it seems to be so atomized, but it's a social logic, and it's something that people are doing deliberately to build free lives. And so I think that there is a heroism in that, but it's hard to kind of find the threads of it.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Brody. Thank you, Anna. It's great to witness this conversation happening. We have a few minutes for Q&A, so perhaps if you have a question, raise your hand, and I will get to you with the microphone. We have one there. So let's do like 2 rounds, and we collect 3 questions each round, so we have more time.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful preview of the book that I'm excited to read. 2 questions. One is a sort of curious about your choice of the word afterlives and how you landed on that. I've heard it a lot in different contexts, and I'm curious why and how that functions in the broader project. And then, if you have time and feel like it, I'm just curious what it's like to make the shift from a sort of Rio world to the Recife world, and what it means in terms of the kinds of archives or the challenges you faces, or if you had to just scale down your thinking or just like rethink everything. How does that transfer change in terms of? process.
One more here.
Thank you, Brody, so much, and Ada, it's been a joy to see you in conversation. Okay, I have a maybe question, one more. Because as you were talking and now responding to Ada and talking about the maybe as a way to mark the silences also of the archives, during your talk, and especially the part that I think is a part of the book that you read to us, I saw I agree that there has to be a method to the maybe, but what I saw you doing is actually thinking about the history of Esperanza not as what actually happened, but what could have happened. And then in doing so, you engage your audience, or you engage your reader in a way that you kind of implicate us in her story. So us right now listening to this story about this tragedy and her murder, what are the choices that we make? How is it that we interpret Brazilian history and the legacies of slavery in the present? And that's why I'm asking you about the maybe, because I think it has a powerful political purpose, perhaps, behind it. So my maybe is about Esperanza's literacy. You talked about it a couple of times, like in passing, and then it just, I think, brought to the fore this kind of irony, right? That she's someone that was taught how to read or write, or both, but is someone that doesn't leave traces in the archives of her own, only of her tragic death. What do you think? Why did you decide to talk about her literacy, and what do you think it means in her story?
Oh, these are great questions. So I'll go through them in order. So afterlives, I mean, as I'm sure all of you know, that's Saidiya Hartman's term. It's everywhere. It's used to mean everything, as far as I can tell right now. What I like about the term, and the reason that I use it, is because an afterlife is not a legacy. I think oftentimes, and translating it into Portuguese is very difficult. I think Saidiya Hartman was just translated maybe 2 years ago. Is that right? And I've seen various people try to use pós-vidas, and there are lots of translations of it, but it's not an easy one to translate. But it's not the same as a legacy. It's not something that was left by something. It's something that's continuous. It's something that continues to be the same thing that it was before, but in a different form. And I think that I like that idea, that there are certain kinds of things that don't die and get resurrected or aren't present in another generation, but rather it's something that mutates and changes, but has something essential that is the same. And so I think that's the reason that I use that. But also, I mean, it's always really difficult to get Brazilian slavery studies in dialogue with U.S. historiographies of slavery. I published with Kayla Grinberg an edited volume maybe 3 years ago, where we took a bunch of the most prominent historians of slavery, and I translated all of their work, and we put it together in a way that we think is fairly accessible for U.S. audiences to read. And, it gets read sometimes, but it's not, the excuse was always that most things haven't been translated, and certainly somebody like Sidney Chalhoub, for example, has never been translated, so it's really difficult to get that work. But there is this kind of barrier, and so I think the more that you're able to sort of connect these ideas or contrast them with what's going on in U.S. historiography, which is just so much still the dominant historiography of slavery. I mean, it's amazing, after Rebecca, after you, after so many people have done such magisterial work about Latin American slavery that people will read, that it still doesn't occur to people that there's a whole world behind that of work that you really can't understand what slavery is without going to it. And so I think it's partly that as well that makes me use it. The shift it's been an interesting one, because I was shifting regions of Brazil, centuries. The historiography of slavery, and I were talking about earlier in Brazil, it's always to me been the most interesting historiography in Brazil. I think it's so rich, it's so nuanced, it's so deep. It's being done by just hordes and hordes of enthusiastic young people who are going out to these archives and uncovering just the most incredible stories with an enthusiasm that you don't see anybody having about archives in the United States. And so it's kind of a joy to work in that field. But it's interesting because the historiography of Recife is also very little known in the South. Brazil is a very regional country, and so there's a whole world of historical investigation that I really had to immerse myself in, even as I was learning slavery studies. And so that is kind of the part of the transition I think that I felt the most, was just, but it wasn't what you would expect. It wasn't that I'm coming from the 20th century and there's so much, and I'm going to Recife in the 19th century and somehow there's less. It's a much vaster historiography than I've ever had to deal with in the 20th century. And so that part of it has been really interesting as a historian. But I'll also say, and this is just a shout out if there is anybody from Recife here, it's been one of the most beautiful research experiences, because the archives are very precarious, and in fact the public archive of Pernambuco is currently closed to consultation because they don't have the physical infrastructure to support it. But people will do everything they can to give you access to these documents. And I've felt so supported, and people are so generous and so willing to just talk for hours about what they know about these documents and where you can find things. It's such an open intellectual world that it's really felt like a process of discovery. Even though the material I'm working with is so depressing, it's been just a joy to do the project for those reasons. Whereas in Rio, actually, it's very bureaucratized and much more difficult to get access to most kinds of documents. And so I think I'm kind of lucky that this was the project that I did when my kids were growing up, and I couldn't be in Brazil as much as I wanted to be because they made it easy for me. In terms of the maybes, I had never really thought about, I think there is a political motive in the sense that even if you can't know why somebody does something, you want people to realize that they did have a why. And so that's the part that I feel is that I agree is absolutely political about using the maybes when you can. And especially when those maybes are coming from a knowledge of the range of possibilities that somebody might have had. Because I think that the issue with speculation sometimes is that we're just imposing our maybes on subjects in the past, what we would have done, the way we would have thought. And so I think when we use a maybe, we really need to be immersed in the world of possibilities, which is how Sue Ann Caulfield describes it oftentimes, the world of possibilities that would have been present in the mind of that person at that time. And I think when you can bring them out, that definitely is political. And I like that idea of engaging an audience and having to engage in that speculation and think about this person as a person, and it's an act of empathy, I suppose, to put yourself inside that. So I love that idea, and I'll surely go back to it as I'm working. In terms of literacy, so the reason that I emphasize it is that it was such a mark of pride among abolitionists to teach their enslaved people to read, the people that they enslaved to read. And the hardest chapter in this whole book for me to write was the one on abolition, because once you go into the deep documents about these very heroic movements that are bringing, several thousand people in this underground railroad to Ceará, and they're spiriting people away at night disguised as other, as ladies, dressed up for a ball. There are all these heroic and much told stories about this movement. But I've done enough work in this place by now that I don't have to take them for what they say they are, because I know they appear in my other cases. I see them doing all kinds of things that they would never admit that they do. And almost every single abolitionist shows up as undermining every value that they stand up for in various places. And so you find people who, for example, will bring an abolitionist lawsuit because they want that person to be dependent on them and labor in their household rather than somebody else's. So that's the only reason they bring the abolitionist lawsuit. It's not in any way to give that person freedom. So in a way, in this context, the literacy is kind of a mark of that hypocrisy. I wouldn't be surprised if Herculina considered herself an abolitionist. She had freed Esperanza without any onus, without any conditions. She had taught her and Felispino to read, and so she may have had pride in herself as being kind of part of that movement. But to me, the kind of emptiness of the abolitionist movement was a kind of parable for what would happen afterward. The people wanted to end slavery, but they didn't want to end those dependent personal relationships or the violence that underlay them. Only a few people really showed themselves to be really committed to that cause. And one of the things that I don't quite have enough evidence, so it's still a maybe, but I think that this same person who ran the Underground Railroad, I think he might have become a speculator who rented out land for Mocambos, for shantytowns in the 20th century. I think he himself might have done that. And so there are those kinds of links that once you look deep enough into somebody, you sort of realize what abolitionism meant and didn't, and that's why I bring attention to the literacy question there.
I do have a question,
Yes.
and I'm very curious to hear more about these connections and unequal exchanges between the historiography in the United States about slavery and the historiography of Brazil. And there was one moment when you mentioned second slavery. I think that's like an export of the West to Brazil, and I think part of the Brazilian historiography on slavery adopted very quickly that concept of second slavery, and the concept of second slavery is connected to a slavery that is rural and in plantations, right? And you were telling a completely different story here of a slavery that survived the shipping of the internal traffic. We see Recife as with this multitude of enslaved workers in your work, in your presentation here, and we could see the names of all of them sharing this one house, right? So in that sense, I would like to hear more from you about how do you see your work contributing, especially this book, to kind of show also to the Brazilians that perhaps they didn't actually need the concept of second slavery, given that more than 50% of enslaved workers actually cohabited and shared the house of their masters and were not working on plantations. So I was just like wondering if you plan also your work on like discuss a little bit more over this concept. And then we have another question here.
Well, I do not have a question, but first of all, I'd like to thank you for a wonderful, very, very enthusiastic and full of knowledge and research that I truly appreciate and thank you for. What I mentioned was that we're also here to honor and commemorate Professor Stanley Stein. And I just asked if I could have a few words of my own personal experience with him as an undergraduate member of the class of 1963 here at Princeton. I didn't really have a lot of courses with him, but I knew him. I had at least one course with him. And what stayed with me my entire life is that one day in my junior year, he came up to me and said, Peter, I look forward to meeting you later after this. Peter, being me, have you thought about the topic for your senior thesis? As we all know, Princetonians have to write a senior thesis before they can go on to the Wild West and Wild East and whatever. So I said, yes, I have. And said, well, is it related to Brazil? Because he knew that I spoke Portuguese. And said, well, it is, but unfortunately, I'm already committed to Professor Paul Sigmund with the Department of Politics, which was my department. And I really am already working on it. I said, well, what is it? He said, well, it's also the northeastern part of Brazil, Recife, boondocks of Pernambuco, and so forth and so forth. So he was trying to talk me out of it. It didn't quite work, but it sort of I think illustrates the richness and the wonderful nature of the academic community that I've felt throughout my many decades here of the richness of the faculty as well as the spirit of what is intended for the undergraduates mostly, but also obviously graduate students. So I ended up in Pernambuco and for the summer and to do research, and I basically went again, not Boa Jardim, not the beaches, I went into the boondocks, way to the west. And I have no idea how they did this, but 1 month into my 2-month stay, a Western Union sort of messenger, I can't remember if he was on a horse or a donkey, but delivered a Western Union telegram addressed to me from Professor Sigmund in Chile. And he said, I'm coming next week, where could we meet? And I met him and introduced him to Francisco Julião and other people, like that. And I'm just, for the rest of my life, I keep thinking of the poet's words of the road not taken, not because I regret working with Professor Sigmund, who's wonderful, but because I couldn't perhaps do both. And I just wanted to mention this on this day. He basically left what I can only characterize here today as a very, well, an indelible, permanent, lasting mark on certainly my life, but also many other lives as well. Thank you, and I look forward to meeting you because we never met. Thank you.
Very short.
Thank you very much for the conversation. And I think my question kind of relates to Isadora and Miqueia somehow, but you mentioned in one of the answers about the difference of Roman law archive, and you mentioned the notion of noisy archive. And for me, it's interesting because also seeing the images that in your presentation, I was thinking about Tina Kemp's work about listening to the images. And I was thinking how you use, how noisy those images are in your work, in the sense of not only the visual archive, how you connect with it, but also the description of the scene of murder. There are all these oracles of Sadia Hartman and Christina Sharp saying the attempts to not reinscribe the violence found in the archive, so how to deal with this and describing this so visual image when you're reading how the body was found. So how also to bring this image to the reader and the audience without reinscribing the violence presented in the archive.
Thank you for those words about Stanley Stein. When I was going through this, I met him several times myself, just at times that I was going through Princeton for one reason or another, and he always seemed to go to everything that had to do with Brazil. And I remember the first time that I was talking about my first book, which has many chapters on the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. And he came up and he asked me some very, very specific questions about evangelicals in a very particular community in Rio. And the reason he was curious is that he and Barbara, when they were first in Brazil in the early 1940s, had been to that place and had come across people who were, doing evangelical work there. And I think he must have talked for 10 minutes about sort of that experience, and I was asking him all kinds of questions. And he had such a fine memory for small details. It was really a beautiful experience to talk with him. So I can understand why you would have missed the chance to work with him. And I'd love to find out more about your experience in the early 60s in Pernambuco. What a place to be. And in a way, what you're talking about is exactly what I think became possible because of the kind of small, everyday social movements that people were able to make in all of these decades between abolition and that point. And so in a way, my book kind of ends with the beginnings of those kinds of movements. But how fascinating. The question about the images and, I think maybe two questions there. One is, how noisy are the images in general, and one is the use that I make of them. So I had some hesitancy in sort of making Esperança's case the center of a talk exactly for that reason, that it's probably, of all of the cases that I deal with in the book, it's probably the one that's the most violent. And I've tried to sort of stay away from a lot of those kinds of cases in the ones that I choose to expose exactly for these reasons, that there's something about the drama of them that overtakes everything else and makes it impossible to sort of imagine that person's world beyond what happened to them. And I think that Hartman is really right obviously she is, in sort of pointing to that as a problem. The issue is what you do with that, because it happens in the Roman law system that violence produces knowledge always. The people that we know about are the people that something happened to, the people that got into some kind of fight, some kind of huge dispute. Sometimes it's a civil case, but those ones give you less detail about relationships. And so, the places that really tell us a lot are the ones that do involve these cases that are difficult to deal with. And so the choice I try to make is to not dwell on the violence any more than I need to tell the story that you need to understand in order to understand the rest of what you can learn from the case. And so in not presenting the visual image, which is really it's horrifying in its peacefulness, actually. It's sort of this very pastoral, kind of beautiful drawing of this horrible thing. And the decision that I made about it was just that I didn't want to show it because I think it's such a powerful image that nobody will be able to see anything else once they see it. And so I don't want to actually present it. I don't want people to see it. There was, when this case first came into the archives, there was an article that was written about it by a black scholar from Bahia in Brazil, where the image really was the very centerpiece of the article. It was just a brief article. And that was done, I think, in a way that shows some of the differences between Brazil and the United States, because I think in Brazil it's been such a battle to actually show that slavery was violent, that people like Erculina, who declared themselves to be sort of benefactors for the people they enslaved, that they were that violent is actually, you know, a point that people want to make. And so in a way, in that intellectual world, people probably are more liberal in their use of violence. And in fact, Maria Helena Machado just published a book that's about kind of a similar case that happened in Maranhão, in São Luís de Maranhão, where the book is really hard to read because the entire book is about this violence that happens to these children, and it's just unrelenting. It just goes on and on and on and on and on. And I think that kind of book probably would not be written in the United States right now, and so it's an interesting kind of debate, I think, between the two fields. But the logic that I had, and I would appreciate, actually, maybe later you can tell me whether you think it's the right logic, is that this is a case that reveals so much that I felt like it has to be told, but that I'm trying to exercise restraint in the actual description of the violence, so it's not any more than a reader needs to understand what I'm saying, and you know, that's the attempt. But other images, I mean, Recife has sort of precious few images, but it's also one of the main places where slave portraiture was important, and where engravers, the kind of people that you've written about so beautifully, where they worked. And so there is a kind of rich visual archive to work from in the 19th century. And then in the 20th century, people treated mocambos or shacks or huts the same way that they treated black people in the 19th century. And so there's a lot of a visual archive about those places that sometimes brings people to the fore. But of course, it's a lot rarer and a lot more deceptive than even other kinds of archives. And so I try to be very careful in the use of it. Yes, I do everything that I can to avoid talking about second slavery in Brazil, because it's one of these academic debates that I don't see why it's so bitter, because it strikes me that every side has something useful and interesting to say, and so I don't understand why people are forced to sort of choose sides, that they believe in it, they don't believe in it. And so I'm officially saying for posterity, I don't choose sides. I think there are things that I like to read on both sides. But I think that there is a point that there is a historiography of slavery that is so concerned with the kind of plantation slavery that was part of the global economy that it loses track of the ways in which slavery is embedded in every other aspect of Brazilian life. And in the Northeast, that is so clear because the Northeast didn't have second slavery. They tried to revive their sugar mills at the end of the 19th century. It didn't really work. Peter Eisenberg's work is the clearest on that. But the main impact of second slavery on the Northeast was that these thousands and thousands of people are being shipped south. And so it's a very different experience of what it was all about. But I think it also begs the question even of, you know, what is the difference between a slave society and a society without slaves? A society with slaves. You know, I think that is a really good distinction if you're really privileging a particular kind of economic function of slavery. But what Ada was referring to in her beautiful comments was that in the rest of this chapter, I really play around with that a lot to sort of say, you know, isn't there such thing as a slavery that even if it's only, you know, in the low teens as a percentage of the population, it touches everything, it structures everything, even if it's not the beating heart of the economy. And I think that that's really what the social historians of Brazilian slavery have shown in so many different contexts that go beyond, you know, what the second slavery scholarship focuses on. So it's not that I think they're wrong, I just think that the exclusive focus on that is, or not wrong in everything, I'm sure there are quibbles, but the exclusive focus on that is the history of slavery really kind of reduces and flattens what slavery means in Brazilian society.
Excellent. So thank you so much. We are out of time, but we have a reception just out of this room, so we can continue the conversation there. And let's just give a last round of applause to Ada and Brodwyn.